Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à tous. Walasi. We join you from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We thank Elder Marlene Companion from the Halibu Mi'kmaq First Nation for joining us throughout our work and for coming this morning to smudge our space. I am Michael MacDonald, Commissioner of the Mass Casualty Commission, and I'm honored to be here once again with my fellow commissioners, Leanne Fitch and Dr. Kim Stanton. Welcome to the family members, participants and council, emergency responders, leaders, policymakers, community groups, media, commission team members, and members of the public, both here in the room and taking part in the live stream. For those of you who are in this space for the first time, I want to share with you that typically we have tables here for our proceedings, and family members would sit at those tables day in, day out together, supporting each other, looking out for each other. And it's different today, not seeing those tables. In a way, I miss those tables because you were such a great inspiration to us with your courage, steadfastness, and how you looked out for each other. Thank you. We are also pleased to be joined by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Premier Tim Houston, Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino, and Federal Minister Sean Fraser. Thank you for being here. It is so important that you are here. Our recommendations call for transformative change. They call for collaboration. They call for leadership. They call for you to champion these recommendations so that our communities in Nova Scotia and Canada will be safer. Today we are here to share our final report with you so that together all Canadians can continue the work of making our communities safer for everyone. Bienvenue tout le monde. Je suis le commissaire Michael MacDonald, président de la Commission des pertes massives, et je suis honoré d'être accompagné de mes collègues Leanne Fitch et Kim Stanton. Nous sommes ici aujourd'hui pour vous annoncer la publication de notre rapport final, afin qu'ensemble, tous les Canadiens puissent continuer de rendre nos collectivités plus sûres pour tous. In April 2020, in the first weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic, the most lethal mass shooting in Canadian civilian history unfolded over 13 terrible hours here in Nova Scotia, my home province. During this time, a perpetrator shot and killed 22 people, one of whom was expecting a child. Many more people were harmed and affected across Canada, the United States, and beyond. The Commission's work was grounded in the memories of those whose lives were taken and all those affected. We paused to remember them each and every day during our public proceedings and carried their names with us while we worked. We asked family members if they would like to commemorate their loved ones in their own words and images, and have included what they shared in our final report. But we would like to pause now to honor the memories of the lives taken with a video. Following the video, we ask you to join us in a moment of silent reflection. On behalf of all Canadians, the federal and Nova Scotia governments established the Commission in October of 2020 to determine what happened, how and why it happened, and to make recommendations to help make our communities safer in the future. You will recall that the Commission's mandate was broad in scope and ambitious in timeline. It required us to investigate the causes, context, and circumstances giving rise to the mass casualty, police responses, and steps taken to inform, support, and engage victims, families, and affected citizens. We were also required to consider related issues, including gender-based and intimate partner violence, public communications and alerting, the perpetrator's prior interactions with police and social services, communications between law enforcement agencies, access to firearms, the relevant police actions, policies, procedures, and training. This mandate was extensive, but it also showed the existing understanding of both levels of government that the mass casualty was not an isolated incident, but the product of a complex web of context, causes, and circumstances. After 2.5 years of independent, comprehensive, and collaborative investigation into every aspect of our broad mandate, today we share with you the culmination of our work. Turning the Tide Together, the final report of the Mass Casualty Commission, provides a thorough account of what happened and the causes, context, and circumstances that gave rise to the mass casualty. Our 7-volume report, including 130 recommendations, is now available on the Commission's website. Among our recommendations, we are calling for major changes to RCMP oversight, processes, and culture. A process to rethink the structure of policing in Nova Scotia, a national review of public alerting, greater focus on addressing and preventing the root causes of violence in our communities, including gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, and family violence, and a much expanded and more collaborative model to ensure community safety and well-being. As we have said before, the role of a public inquiry is not to assign blame, but to investigate what happened, study contributing factors, and provide meaningful recommendations for change. Our focus and findings are on how institutional structure and systemic factors shaped or were reflected in the actions of individuals. However, we do not shy away from declaring hard truths and accountability. We identify them precisely so we can learn from them and do better. Our findings and recommendations relate specifically to the critical incident response by police and the role of public safety partners, health and victim service providers, and communities. Crucially, we consider the broader root causes of violence, how such violence can be prevented, and how we can all help to improve community safety and well-being. We have called this report Turning the Tide Together because we know that it will take all of us across our country, working together to tackle the significant challenges to turn the tide on underlying causes of violence in our communities. Ce rapport, Redresser la barre ensemble, demande que nous travaillions tous ensemble pour relever les défis et les causes fondamentales de la violence dans nos collectivités. Commissioner Stanton will now share more on the structure of our final report.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à tous. Welasi. The report is a culmination of everything we've heard and learned, and builds on information and insights gathered from multiple sources and many people. This included gathering and reviewing tens of thousands of documents, interviews with over 230 people, input from 61 participants, hearing from 60 witnesses during public proceedings, learning from 22 commissioned reports, hearing from more than 100 experts during 20 roundtables and other discussions, preparing an environmental scan, including over 2,000 relevant recommendations from previous inquiries and reports, and hearing from over 1,000 members of the public. In accordance with the mandate, we organized our work into 3 overlapping phases. In phase 1, we focused on gathering the facts, establishing what happened leading up to, during, and after the mass casualty. Next, we examined the causes, context, and circumstances of the mass casualty in order to answer the questions about how and why it occurred, and to understand the facts in the broader context. Finally, we looked forward and focused on what lessons we'd learned and how best to make a difference in the future. Dans la phase finale de notre travail, nous nous sommes concentrés sur la meilleure façon de changer les choses à l'avenir. In addition to this phased approach, we organized the Commission's work around 3 main themes or pillars focused on violence, community, and policing. This helped to connect the dots between specific facts, issues, contexts, causes, and circumstances. The final report follows a similar structure. Volume 1 begins with a commemoration of the lives taken and the ripple effect the mass casualty had in our communities. This volume explains how this impact situates the context and purpose of the Commission's work. Volume 2 is about what happened. It sets out the Commission's main findings on what happened immediately before, during, and in the aftermath of the mass casualty. While we encourage you to read Volume 2 in its entirety, we have included a condensed overview of what happened in the executive summary. Establishing what happened and providing as much clarity as possible about the timing of how the mass casualty unfolded was very important to us and to many of you here. In addition to Volume 2, an interactive timeline is available on the Commission's website, along with an instructional video and guidance. Having set out what happened in Volume 2, we use those main findings in subsequent volumes as we focus on how and why things happened as they did. Volume 3 shines a light on the root causes of violence in our communities and how they can be prevented. Volume 4 sets out how a broad community-wide approach to public safety will help to address the root causes of violence and make everyone safer. In Volume 5, we bring forward ways to rethink policing in Canada as part of an expanded community safety approach. In Volume 6, we consider how best to implement the many recommendations we've made in the final report, ensuring that actions are taken and sustained. Finally, in Volume 7, we describe the various processes involved in leading and designing the Commission in order to be of assistance to future inquiries. Commissioner Fitch will now share more about our approach to findings and recommendations.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Stanton, and good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. As expected, the final report includes many findings and recommendations. These are woven throughout the report in context and also included as a complete list in the executive summary. Our recommendations are designed with 2 objectives in mind. 1, how can we prevent violence from happening in the first place? And second, when violence does occur, how can we ensure we have an effective approach and, when need be, an effective critical incident response? Achieving these objectives will reduce the likelihood of mass casualty incidents and minimize the lethality of critical incidences. Together, we can substantially decrease the threat and impact of violence, including mass violence. We have designed the recommendations to be clear and pragmatic, so that people across our governments, institutions, and communities can begin to take action right away. Nous avons conçu les recommandations pour qu'elles soient claires et pragmatiques et pour que les gens puissent agir immédiatement. While we cannot cover all of our findings and recommendations with you in detail today, we would like to share more on how we have thoroughly responded to every aspect of our mandate, highlighting some of our main findings, lessons learned, and recommendations. First, as you know, we needed to investigate what happened, including how the RCMP and other police forces responded and the steps taken to inform, support, and engage victims, families, and affected citizens. Volume 2 focuses on what happened and contains the Commission's main findings in 2 key areas: how the mass casualty unfolded, and the institutional and systemic failures in the response, including missed opportunities to prevent violence. In this volume, we include a very detailed account of the 13 hours of the mass casualty, starting with the perpetrator's violent assault of his common-law spouse and continuing through the subsequent fatalities and other acts of violence committed on April 18th and 19th, 2020. Our investigation made clear that there were many warning signs of the perpetrator's violence and missed opportunities to intervene in the years prior to the mass casualty. Next, we focus on the gaps and errors in the critical incident response to the mass casualty as it unfolded. While we acknowledge and commend the individual actions and courage of many first responders, the overarching approach and response by the RCMP as an institution had many shortcomings. This must be addressed, and responses must be improved. It is also important to note that community members played a critical role in responding to the mass casualty, often putting themselves in harm's way to help others. However, the information they shared concerning the perpetrator was often not properly recorded, shared, or acted upon by the RCMP. There were failures in communications with the public during and in the aftermath of the mass casualty. These must be addressed. That is why in the final report we call for a national review and redesign of the public alert system. In addition to learning what happened, we were also directed to examine a number of related issues in our mandate. Many of these related issues focus on relevant policing structures and processes. This is why policing has been a pillar in our overarching work and the focus of Volume 5. In Volume 5, we share specific steps that the RCMP, municipal police, and other public safety partners can take to improve critical incident preparedness, planning, and response. These changes will help better protect Canadians and community members and the police officers who step up to respond to critical incidents in the future. We set out principles of effective critical incident response based on preparedness, the uncertainty, community engagement, working together across agencies, and learning from experience. Next, we determined that the future of the RCMP and of provincial policing requires focused reevaluation. There is a need to rethink the role of police in a wider ecosystem of public safety. Significant changes are needed to address various community safety and well-being needs in the 21st century. To do so, the existing culture of policing must change. To ensure greater transparency and public accountability, we have recommended a range of measures. These include amending the RCMP Act to clarify the relationship between the RCMP Commissioner and the Federal Minister of Public Safety. We recommend clarifying the role of the RCMP Management Advisory Board. The bodies that hold police agencies accountable also need to be properly resourced. we recommend strengthening the role of the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission. We also call on the RCMP to adopt a more strategic and coordinated approach to contract policing and core policing functions. For Nova Scotia in particular, we call for a community-wide process to discuss and decide the future structure of policing services in this province. A culture of interoperability between emergency responders and other community safety agencies is required. This includes improved information sharing between all concerned. In addition, we established that everyday policing practices, including decision-making, note-taking, and supervision, must be improved. This is important given all the ways that daily decision-making determines which crimes and which social problems come to broader official attention and how effectively social and criminal problems are countered. Throughout the final report, we emphasize that effective police agencies are learning institutions, capable of recognizing and responding to the changing expectations of their communities, and capable of learning from their past actions in order to do better in the future. To do so, a culture of learning and accountability within the RCMP and all police services is required. Term-limited training must be replaced with ongoing police education. To that end, there must be a complete overhaul of police education in Canada, followed by recruiting officers suitable for modernized policing. Such transformation is essential to improve all aspects of the RCMP's future work and that of other agencies. We also identify the need to make sure police understand the importance of securing the safety of all those who experience and are at greater risk of violence. This will entail a much greater focus on violence prevention and better ways to collaborate with other services. Most importantly, the RCMP must finally undergo fundamental change that previous reports have called for. Canadian society is at a critical juncture with respect to the future of policing. The road forward must include a reckoning with the unfulfilled promises of community policing and a commitment for community safety and well-being for everyone in the future. La société canadienne se trouve à un moment critique en ce qui concerne l'avenir des services de police. Nous devons faire face à la promesse non satisfaite de la police communautaire. Commissioner MacDonald will now say more about our findings and recommendations concerning violence.
Thank you, Commissioner Fitch. Consistent with the related issues in our mandate, in Volume 3 of our final report, we focus on violence, and in particular, how it is critically important that we address the root causes of violence. One question we considered is whether mass casualties can be predicted. We concluded that rather than prediction, the focus has to be on prevention and effective intervention. While no person or institution could have predicted the perpetrator's specific actions on April 18th and 19th, 2020, his pattern and escalation of violence could have and should have been addressed. Many red flags about his violent and illegal behavior were known by a broad range of people and have been brought to the attention of police and others over a number of years. The perpetrator was raised in a violent home and became a violent man. We explore how his violent, intimidating, and coercive behavior extended ever outward to his intimate partners, to his relatives, to his friends, to his neighbors, to his business associates, and to his patients, to vulnerable and marginalized people, and even to individuals in positions of power and control, such as police officers. Mass casualties are rare, but women, children, and other marginalized people in communities experience violence every day. perceptions of where the real danger lies is largely misconceived. Our society ignores the hard truth of the normalcy of violence between intimate partners and within families and the ways in which this violence spills out and escalates to affect other people too. Gender-based violence is also widespread and underreported in Canada. For far too long, our society has misperceived mass violence as our greatest threat without considering its relationship to our other more pervasive forms of violence. We do so at the expense of public safety. We do so at the expense of community well-being. We do so at our collective peril. The evidence shows clearly that those who perpetrate mass casualties often have an unaddressed history of gender-based intimate partner or family violence. Les faits montrent clairement que ceux qui commettent des actes d'une telle violence ont souvent un historique de violence familiale entre partenaires intimes ou fondée sur le sexe. Many mass casualties begin with an act of such violence. That was the case here in Nova Scotia in April of 2020, and that was the case last fall in September of 2022 in Saskatchewan. Throughout our work, as we have learned how the perpetrator targeted members of marginalized communities in Nova Scotia, we realized that it provided but one example of the ways in which historic patterns of violence are sustained and amplified. The inescapable conclusion is that ensuring the safety and security of everyone will assist in minimizing the risks of mass casualties. La conclusion incontournable est que le fait d'assurer la sécurité de tous nous aidera à minimiser le risque des pertes massives. Valuing all members of our community from childhood onward will contribute to making our communities safer for everyone. In addition, regulations regarding access to firearms, ammunition, and police paraphernalia must also be strengthened and enforced. We make a series of recommendations to this effect, including that the federal government engage with communities to ensure firearms regulations are enforced in a consistent and effective manner. Commissioner Stanton will now talk more about community safety and implementation.
Thank you. Our mandate required us to investigate and consider many things, including community supports, social services, mental health services, and to give particular consideration to groups that may have been differentially affected by the mass casualty. Having discussed the need to improve policing in Canada and the importance of addressing the root causes of violence in our communities, we turn to the role of communities in general and rural communities in particular. In Volume 4 of the final report, we set out why we must invest in a public safety system that is about more than police services, where multiple partners work together every day with substantial community engagement. Community safety planning needs to take into account social development, prevention, early intervention, and critical incident response. We find that the social determinants of health, including equality, access to housing, health and social services, adequate income, and education, are also the social determinants of community safety and well-being. It follows that a public health-based approach to community safety is the best model for the future. This means community safety planning should address 4 areas: social development, prevention, early intervention, and critical incident response. It means public policy and funding should put crime prevention on an equal footing with enforcement of the criminal law. It means the focus of policing should be, how do we prevent further violence? This in turn requires seeing support services in the community as full partners in community safety who will assist and respond when community members need help or in crisis. Community safety and well-being are not just about policing. They're about engaging both policing and non-policing partners to ensure that violence prevention is a central focus of public safety. Police should be one part of the community safety net. Their important responsibilities to ensure public safety are shared with community members, other organizations, and institutions. This would enable each partner in community safety to focus on the part of that public safety web that best suits their knowledge and expertise. We conclude it is time to transform the conception of community policing by focusing on community safety and well-being, and by elevating the primary role of other institutions and agencies, including community-based organizations. While we must place community at the center of our public safety system, police services will continue to have a vital but not exclusive role, performing the duties for which they're best suited. We recommend that the federal government enact legislation to create a framework designed to support and enhance community safety and well-being in every province and territory. To further strengthen federal and provincial and territorial initiatives that may already be underway, we recommend that the federal legislation include the establishment within a year of a Community Safety and Well-Being Leadership Council composed of leaders from all sectors. In support of these legislative and structural reforms, we recommend that Canada needs broad public and institutional education on community safety and well-being as well. Turning to rural communities, such as those most affected by the mass casualty in Nova Scotia, we find that rural community well-being is constrained by limited access to services, poverty, under-inclusion, and in some cases, this negatively affects the occupational health and safety of rural service providers. We also find that urban bias in policymaking and service delivery contributes to inadequate community safety, public infrastructure, and services in rural communities. We recommend that when it comes to community safety, provincial governments take steps to address urban bias in decision-making by fostering meaningful inclusion of rural communities in all areas affecting them, and that the federal government support the inclusion of rural communities in decision-making on issues within their jurisdiction. Whether for rural communities or our communities at large, the significant overhaul of community safety thinking, planning, and approach we are calling for in the final report has the potential to be truly transformative in Canada. Les changements dans la réflexion, la planification, et l'approche à la sécurité communautaire dans le rapport final ont le potentiel d'être véritablement transformateurs au Canada. The breadth of this challenge and opportunity is why we think about community safety as a shared responsibility and a shared opportunity. We all need to be champions for change, taking the recommendations from this report and implementing them in our policies, our communities, workplaces, and organizations. Some of our recommendations can be implemented relatively quickly and easily. Others will take more time and collaboration, both within and between different groups and institutions. In order to build and sustain momentum over the months and years required to make the longer-term changes, people from many different settings and roles across society will need to keep taking action, being advocates, and holding each other accountable in ways that are supportive and constructive. As you've heard today and will read in the final report, many of the recommendations will require action from political leaders and public institutions like the RCMP. To help ensure accountability and progress, we're calling for the federal and Nova Scotia governments to jointly form an implementation and mutual accountability body that will include representatives from government, the RCMP, municipal police, those most affected, and key communities. This body will be responsible for creating an implementation plan and providing regular updates to government and to the public. This recommendation is included in Volume 6 of the final report, in which we also consider next steps and actions that individuals and groups in our communities can take to realize our shared goal of making the places we live safer for everyone. Commissioner Fitch will now acknowledge on behalf of all three of us the many people who've contributed to our work and our final report. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Stanton. Like all the Commission's work, preparing and sharing the final report would not have been possible without the hard work and contributions of many people. We thank the families for being here today and for your unwavering courage and commitment throughout this entire process. We continue to extend our deep and lasting condolences for your losses, and we share your dedication to making communities safer in their memories. You fought for public inquiry, and you have called for meaningful change. The final report can be the blueprint for that change. We encourage you, if you choose, to keep speaking up to ensure that positive change happens. As a reminder, when we refer to participants in the inquiry, we are including those most affected individuals, the families, governments, first responders, and organizations including advocacy groups. We want to thank all participants and their counsel. You have all played a critical role during the inquiry, and your many submissions and contributions have been instrumental in helping us to learn and to prepare our recommendations. We heard you. Please know we heard you. Now the final report is ready. Please continue to be champions of implementation. We also thank the many other people who have contributed to this work, including emergency responders, witnesses, roundtable members, commissioned report authors, community organizations, the media, service providers, members of the public, and every member of our commission team. The quality and breadth of the final report reflects all your incredible contributions over the last 2.5 years. We could not have done it without all of you. Now that the final report is here, we call on you to continue stepping up so that the great harm caused by the mass casualty can be transformed into great hope and great good for our communities in the future. Commissioner MacDonald will provide some concluding remarks as our Commission's chair. Commissioner MacDonald.
Thank you, Commissioner Fitch, and thank you, Commissioner Stanton. It's been truly an honor to serve with each one of you, and I know you feel the same. To all of you joining us today and to all Canadians, we are pleased to share the Mass Casualty Commission's final report. It comprehensively responds to every aspect of our mandate. It sets out what happened. It sets out our findings and how and why things happened as they did. And it provides a future-focused recommendations that when implemented, will change our country for the better. It is a substantial report and a comprehensive roadmap to a safer Canada. Please take the time to read it to reflect and determine how best you can support its implementation. We recognize that this is not the first report to make findings and recommendations like these, but with all of your help, it could be the last. Let me repeat that. With all of your help, it could be the last. Prime Minister Trudeau, Premier Houston, all premiers of provinces and territories, all municipal leaders, police leaders. Commissioner Duhaime is here. We very much appreciate that. Right on this stage, to my left, Commissioner Lucky gave this commission an undertaking that she would champion our recommendations, and we feel that that ought to be considered an institutional undertaking and rely upon you, Commissioner Duhaime, for that. To community-based organizations and all of you, this is a blueprint to transform community safety in this country. This is a blueprint that can make Canada a world leader when it comes to community safety. This is a blueprint that, when implemented, it will establish that those wonderful, dear lives that were taken on April 18th and 19th would not have been taken in vain. Those lives cannot have been taken in vain. That cannot happen. Future acts of violence are preventable if we have the will to do what is necessary. Ce n'est pas le premier rapport à faire ses conclusions et ses recommandations, mais avec votre aide, ça pourrait être le dernier. Les actes de violence sont évitables si nous avons la volonté de faire ce qui est nécessaire. Turning the tide on the underlying causes of violence in our communities will take courage, it will take commitment, and it will take collaboration. It will take the courage to admit that we face a set of interconnected and complex challenges, which means we must resist the default to simple answers and impulsive responses that have failed us all too often in the past. As a country, we need the commitment to keep going month after month, year after year, making steady improvements and sustained efforts to shift entrenched values, fix broken systems, and make violence prevention our guiding star. Most important of all, it will take collaboration from all Canadians, including leaders, policymakers, first responders, service providers, public institutions, community groups, and members of the public. So we are relying on the various offices, the Prime Minister's office, the Premier's office, all levels of government, police leaders, all police leaders, chiefs and leaders, relying on you to do right by all those whose lives were taken and to do right by all those who remain suffering in heartache. Surtout, il faudra la coopération de tous les Canadiens, faisant de la prévention de la violence notre principe directeur. By working together, you helped us develop meaningful, practical, and sustainable recommendations for the future. Now we call on you to implement them and make our communities safer for everyone. We all have a lot of work to do. It's time to act. Thank you. Merci. Namoltis.